Yes.
The legend. I've heard so much about you.
I live in College Station, Texas.
Okay, and what brought you to College Station from Houston?
Well, floods. We lived on Cypress Creek for many years, and finally FEMA came along and made us an offer we couldn't refuse for the privilege of bulldozing our home.
Did you know this was the 50th year of the State Bar CLE?
I did not.
It is.
50 years.
I want to know what your role was in the very first CLE given by the State Bar of Texas.
I'm going to tell you a secret you probably don't know.
Can I share it?
Sure.
Okay.
When the Family Code Title II, which is all the parent-child stuff and so on, when that was finally passed effective January 1, 1974, it had all kinds of concepts in it that were new to Texas lawyers: continuing jurisdiction, the whole idea of a suit affecting the parent-child relationship, paternity proceedings, termination of parental rights. That was all new to Texas lawyers. The law was to go into effect, it was passed by the legislature in 1973 to go into effect January 1, 1974. And it dawned on us that it was going to go into effect and none of the lawyers were going to have a clue what all of this was about. And so the State Bar very hurriedly put together a faculty, and we went around and did 2-day seminars in practically every town in Texas bigger than Beaumont over the course of a compressed maybe 4 or 5 month period. Okay. And that was before the advanced course, but that was, to my knowledge, at least in family law, was the first organized push for CLE. And that actually all predated the what we refer to as the Family Code, which really wasn't the whole code. Title I having to do with property, and I believe it was Title IV at the time having to do with juvenile law. It had previously been passed, but since it's not the sort of thing that impacts so many families the way the divorce and child custody things do, it didn't have near the public attention as that Title II did when it was passed.
So Don, I wanted to know how the State Bar went about choosing the speakers for the first course.
The Family Law Council at that time was much smaller than it is now. I've forgotten how many people may have been on the council in 72 and 73, maybe a dozen. Okay. And so we were not only the Family Law Council, we were also the Legislative Committee. We are the ones that drafted over the course of a almost 2-year period, almost every weekend. Okay. For an extended period of time. So that same small group of people that did the drafting, we were the only people that knew and wrestled with the concepts and so on. Okay. So as a practical matter, the faculty was sort of self-selected by the people who were in the drafting process of Title II.
So would you say that the committee were made up of the council members who actually came up with the legislative concepts?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Not all council members were involved, but the vast majority of the council members, many of whom are just the pioneers of this whole process: Reba Razor, Louise Raggio, Don Smith, Tom Purdom, Eugene Smith, the law professor who was the chairman at the time, Joe McKnight, myself, Everett Lord. We were on the council when all this happened, and so we essentially, many of us ended up being the speakers in that first round of
the very first one.
Yeah.
And where was it held?
In every town of any size. We went to El Paso and Dallas and Houston and San Antonio and Corpus Christi, and just it was quite a circuit.
But there was one very first formal CLE put on by the State Bar, and that was at U of H, if I'm not mistaken?
Well, but see, that's later on.
Okay.
The Family Code Title II went into effect in January of '74. Specialization didn't come along until '76.
Mm-hmm.
We had the first round of CLE in relationship to the Family Code before specialization came along. As a matter of fact, one of my lawyer friends from San Antonio I'd known many years, when we finally passed the Title II of the Family Code, he wrote me a note, and he said that he had practiced law for many years and had been able to decipher family law. It had been very difficult for him, and now we'd only made it worse because we'd written it in code.
Let me get this straight. In '73, the council put on classes at a lot of the cities around the state, just to educate people of the concepts.
In anticipation of the effectiveness of the Title II of the Family Code, January 1, 1974.
Okay.
The whole idea of continuing jurisdiction, that was a brand new thing. And there were so many other concepts that were part of this family code that were just brand new to all the lawyers.
Do you remember the first CLE in Houston years later? Was that always going to happen, or did that decision come after you guys went around the state educating people?
We went around the state educating people unrelated to specialization in 1973.
Right.
Okay. Then, and there may have been, I honestly don't recall whether there were any state bar sponsored CLE programs related to family law in the interim. But what happened is that when family law became a specialization and there was going to be a specialization exam in 1976, then it was decided by the powers that be that the people who were going to take the exam would benefit from having a seminar which would cover the types of issues and questions that would be on the examination.
Okay. So Don, you told me that the first specialization exam actually led the powers that be to form the first family law CLE 50 years ago, because they needed to educate those who wanted to take the specialization exam. Is that correct?
That's what that round of specialization, of courses was for originally. Was preparation, specific preparation for the specialization exam.
Okay.
The first of which was at the University of Houston in 1976.
All right. And you were one of those speakers. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what did you talk on? Do you remember?
Termination and adoption and legitimation.
You not only taught one of those courses, you actually wrote the part of the specialization exam that year for the very first one. Is that correct?
I wrote all of the specialization exam the very first year.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I thought there were many writers and graders for that first test.
No.
Were you it?
I was it.
Do you remember the topics that you wrote about?
Oh gosh, but we had questions on venue, jurisdiction, SAPSers, modification, various property issues, you know, a whole widespread set of questions to seek to determine who did and did not have special proficiency and qualifications to hold themselves out as a specialist.
Wait, so the first exam, can you tell me, if you recall, what was covered on it, how long that test was?
The test was, if I'm not mistaken, it may have even been 2 days long.
Okay.
And it covered the person's knowledge of property concepts, marital property concepts, trial procedure, questions related to jurisdiction and venue, evidence.
It sounds much like the exam we take today.
Yeah. I may be wrong, it's been a really long time, but I don't believe there may have been some multiple choice questions, but
Okay.
most of it was essay in those days.
Okay.
Just like in law school in those days, the infamous blue books of law school, very few law schools in those days tested with things like true, false, and multiple choice.
Mm-hmm.
It was all essay type thing. And if I'm not mistaken, it was the first test that I wrote was almost all essay.
Okay. How many years did you write the exam alone?
I believe I wrote the exam alone the first 2 years. I wrote parts of it and got help the next 2 years, maybe 3 years, and then, but I couldn't take the specialization exam as long as I was writing it, so I laid out, and I had to lay out 4 years because in those days they had a policy of changing at least 25% of the test each year.
Okay.
So I had to lay out 4 years to get to a point where the test would not be in part
Something you wrote.
that I wrote. Yeah.
Now, I heard that you set out 1 year, but you're telling me that you set out 4 years.
Yeah, 4 years.
Do you recall after you stopped writing it, whether there was a committee formed at that point, or did other people just start writing it?
Sometime, I mean, you gotta understand all this happened all at once. In fact, I had not been contacted in advance to write the examination. There was an examination in place at the time, and I, on behalf of the Family Law Council, met with the Board of Legal Specialization, who parenthetically had not consulted with the family law section before they chose family law as a specialization. So I was sent over to the board as a liaison from the family law section, and it was during the course of those meetings that they asked me to look at the examination and review it. They just wanted my comments on it because, interestingly enough, the Board of Legal Specialization at that time did not have any members on it who would profess to be primarily family lawyers.
Okay.
So I looked at the examination and came back and reported to them, in my opinion, no lawyer that I knew could pass that examination because it was virtually 100% a property exam and had very little, if anything, to do with any knowledge of process, procedure, evidence, or anything of that nature. It was just too deep and too narrow for practicing lawyers. And so it was at that point I was asked if I could write an exam, and I agreed to try, and shut myself up for, I've forgotten, a couple of weeks and wrote the exam. So anyway, obviously that was going to be far more than any one person could do to write that exam and grade it. And so a commission, sometime within that year or the next year, they formed a commission, an exam commission, and that's how the examination. There was an exam commission, and there was a grading commission. I've forgotten what they called it, but there was a group that wrote it, and another group that.
Right. So you wrote the exam, and then you graded every single one of the first exams. Did you do that all the other years as well?
No, the second year I enlisted some of my colleagues who had taken the exam the first year. Okay. John Nichols, for example, comes to mind. My old friend John and Oliver Hurd, who from San Antonio, who's also one of the pioneers in this group. The other element of this specialization thing that I got involved in is there was a committee that had to determine how we were going to single out people who had what was called substantial involvement in family law in order to be allowed to take the test. And part of the application, I assume it still is references from other lawyers. And that first year, maybe even the second year, the Family Law Advisory Commission, I think it was called, determined that if a prospective applicant, when the referrals came out and the referrals on questions of their knowledge of procedure and courtroom procedure and evidence and so on did not reach to a certain level, we gave them an oral exam. Oh. And we actually had 2 or 3, as I recall, that we had a scripted trial script with a judge. We didn't use a judge, we used a lawyer, but with an opposing counsel. And there were 3 that I recall that came to Austin and participated in a mock trial in order for us to determine how well they understood evidence and procedure. So,
how long did that last?
Well, it lasted 1 year, I think. We finally figured out that was way too labor intensive.
I never heard that story.
Yeah. So.
And how many passed? Did you have a great passage rate with that?
My recollection is 2 out of those 3 passed, and 1 did not. Now I've forgotten, but it was. Well, if you recall, I know you've received inquiries from BLS from other people who've given your name as a reference, and there's in those days at least, there was a questionnaire, and they would ask you to rate a person's skills on a scale of 1 to 5 or whatever it was. And so that determination was made that if an applicant their peers did not rate them, I'm going to arbitrarily say a 3 or above, it may have been some other number, but anyway, that they would have an opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge of courtroom procedure and so on. And sure enough, 3 of them applied, and 2 of them passed and 1 of them didn't.
I have to say, I'm just glad they don't have that anymore.
Yeah, me too. Members of the advisory commission, we met in Austin, and I forgot, we used some judge's courtroom, and we did just videoed it and acted like it was a real thing.
Oh my goodness. Who came up? I have in my possession the very first material for the very first CLE at U of H.
Mhm.
Who came up with that schedule, and who chose the speakers? I think you told me they came from the council, correct?
Mm, it would have been probably recommendations of the council with the help of Gene Cavan, who was the director of CLE for the State Bar at the time.
Okay.
But it was kind of one of those natural fits. It was primarily the same people that had done this earlier round of seminars.
Okay.
But I really don't recall exactly how that was done.
I interviewed Al Green, and he had lots of great things to say about you, of course, so I knew automatically that you would be the second person that I would interview. Al told me, in which I heard you say, that the State Bar CLEs really began because of the need for specialization. It was created because of specialization, is that correct?
My opinion is that it was, and I've written about this somewhere, it was just a perfect storm. Title II, which was where family lawyers were at. Title II is what brought together all the law about custody and parent-child relationships in general, and in divorce, and all of these things in one place. And Title II kind of brought the lawyers together, and specialization just carried that wave on. And one thing we haven't talked about, but which was part of that same thing, was the Form Book Project.
Okay.
And all of this happened in the space of the same 2-3 years, and it just it's a chicken and egg thing. Specialization, at least in family law, was a result of the energy created by Title II.
Okay.
By the same token, specialization is what sparked the advanced courses, and in turn the advanced courses further solidified the family law bar and expanded it, and so it in my judgment, the family law section then and now it's different than a typical section of lawyers that practice the same sort of thing. Mm-hmm. There's a lot more identity of one another in terms of friendship and shared experiences and so on. And all that was a result of all those things happening right within a little 5 or 6 year period back in the 70s.
Did you know that we have over 5,000 members of the family law section right now?
Isn't that amazing?
What do you think about that?
Oh, it's just amazing. I have no idea how many members there were back when I got involved in this thing, but I'm sure it was in the hundreds at most.
There weren't over 200. I looked it up.
Yeah.
About 5,000 now.
Yeah.
Why do you, if you have an opinion, what do you think about the growth in that section? Do you think that has anything to do with the family law CLEs that you guys started way back then?
Oh, sure. In family law was just an example of it, but the continuing legal education programs of the State Bar of Texas were absolutely the gold standard all over the country. I've over the years, I don't know how many hundreds of places I've been speaking on one thing or another. It doesn't matter whether it's Billings, Montana, or Atlanta, Georgia. People will come up and say, you all in Texas have the best education for lawyers. The farm book story.
I have not.
When the family code was enacted in '73 to be effective in January of 1975, the state bar came to the family law council and said, well, we need a farm book. And we said, out of your mind, you couldn't get a farm book the next 6 months. And but they said, yeah, but we really need one. And so we said, well, we couldn't do one. There's bound to be problems with it. And so they said, well, if you can put together forms the best you can, and then once it goes into effect, then there'll be a supplement. And so we took the position that we would do this, but there would be a caveat to the lawyers who bought the book that this was done in limited time, and there would be a more expanded and carefully thought out edition. And that, and you probably all know, tell this story. We did that under those conditions, and then we drafted a new form book, and the original book was the Brown book, I think. And then we came out with a two volume form book, and the State Bar wanted to sell the new form book to the same people who bought the old form book, and the Family Law Council said no. We represented to these people that this was a product in process, and that when we got a full form book, you would have it, and we're not going to sell them the book twice. And we almost refused to finish that form book until we had an understanding with the State Bar that they would get complete credit for what they had paid for the old book against whatever the cost of the new book was. And so that was before the Family Law Practice Manual. And then Harry Tyndall came along and was appointed chairman of that committee, and the Family Law Practice thing started, which was a lifelong endeavor, still going on.
What year were you licensed? You didn't tell me that.
61.
1961. Are you still practicing, or you consider yourself retired?
I'm retired. I've got another job now.
Okay. So, who was Sam Price? Sam Emerson, I'm sorry. Who was Sam Emerson?
Oh my gosh. It's kind of hard to say unless you want to talk about it in some context. Sam, personally, to me, was a dear personal friend. He was an unusually bright man, very understated. And if I'm not mistaken, I am the one that suggested nominated Sam to be on the Family Law Council. Separate and apart from that, Sam decided he wanted to be a judge, and was appointed to a new bench in Harris County by Governor Dolph Briscoe. And he just turned out to be just the best judge you could imagine, with one exception, and that is he wanted to think about stuff so long that sometimes by the time he'd figured out what the law was, in case he'd forgotten the facts, and he'd literally have to call the lawyers back in and remind him of the facts. Sam was a brilliant lawyer, and he was took part in virtually all of the hard work of the legislation and the family code form book and all of that. He was always our anchor as we would get off on tangents about this, that, or the other. Sam would be the one to remind us always of what effect is this going to have on my plumber and my electrician and the guy that works at the grocery store that comes in my court. You got to remember all those people and what we're really about.
And there's an award given in his name. Did you have anything to do with that?
Well, kind of yes and no. I believe the award was conceived by the TAFLS Board. I awarded the first. I had the privilege of awarding the first Sam Emerson Award to Barbara Culver, who was a judge out in West Texas. But the Emerson Award was, as I say, that was a concept that the board of TAFLS came up with. And it was, and I think still is probably considered within family law circles to be the most prestigious award we've got.
And I heard you got it yourself.
Yeah.
About 7 years after the concept, is that correct?
Long time ago. Yeah, that sounds right, 7, 8 years. Two of the real guiding forces in this whole thing were Louise Raggio and Reba Razor in Dallas, who were just giants lawyers. But as a whole, no, that's true. And this is another thing about what the family code wrote. The lawyers were out there, they just didn't know each other. They just, in this, heck, was a way for them to identify each other. Oh gosh, Marion Rosen was a great lawyer. And Barbara Jordan. I had a number of cases against, just ordinary old divorce cases against Barbara years. She was a great lawyer, great person. But anyway, yeah, you're right. As a whole, it was but back in certainly the 60s and early 70s, it was generally a boys' club.
Subsection at one time.
1975 to 77, yeah.
How was that experience?
Well, I was thinking back, all the excitement was over by then, just about. It was a rewarding experience, but we didn't have any battles to fight, so it was fairly benign. Let's put it that way. This was back when the section chair was a 2-year term instead of 1 year. That went on for another 2 or 3 terms before they finally decided 2 years was just too much for anybody. But
one last question for you.
Yeah.
Are you surprised at the growth of the family law section? Did you foresee this back 50 years ago?
No, but if you change that question and ask if about 40 years ago, I wouldn't have been surprised, because all these things I've talked about had happened by then, and specialization took off, and the advanced course took off, and 1 year you'd have 600 people at the advanced course, and the next year it'd be 850, and the next year it'd be 1,200, and I mean, it was just so obvious. Yeah, once it took off, it just took off. And,
Are you proud of the work that you guys did back then?
oh yeah.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you for all the work you did, all the time and the labor that you put in for somebody like me to come along and be double board certified and on the council and on the TFLS board. Because if you hadn't done all that, I wouldn't have the opportunity. And I just want to say thank you for your time.
It's our pleasure.
We appreciate you.
My privilege. What do you bring?